Hello and welcome to today's class. We are going to be looking at perspectives on infrastructure in today's class. Now, what comes to your mind when you think of infrastructure? You probably think of roads, you probably think of the taps in your house, maybe the pipes around it, maybe you think of electricity. But a lot of what we see or know as infrastructure is also hidden behind the surface, right? So we might see the tap, but we might not see the pipes that connect it. We might see the flush in our toilets, but we might not have a sense of, the whole plumbing that goes below it. Similarly, the engineering marvel that goes into the construction of roads and bridges and flyovers and so on are very computer. I mean, think about it. Like an inert artifact, it looks like an object, but it relies on infrastructures that are related to conduits through which information flows, several networks, softwares, hardwares made in different parts of the world. It relies on 2G, 3G, 4G, whatever internet connections we are looking at. So a whole lot of things come together to make what we know as infrastructure. And we are largely going to look at these aspects of our life in today's class. Now, for the most part, infrastructures were looked at as backdrop to social life, as something that is an artifact, as an object that just lies there, or maybe creates the stage for social life. So it's the backdrop, it's the building inside which action happens, right? It's the stage on which we perform. So this was predominantly the framework for the longest time. Even in classical sociology, when we look at classical sociology, there is a latent presence of infrastructure in classical sociology. When we look at, for example, the work of Marx, when he talks about the base superstructure model. In the base, when we are looking at modes and means of production, we are also taking into account the material means of production, such as infrastructures that enable production, right? So it sits there as a condition of possibility for commodity production, and to a large extent the kinds of infrastructures Marx would say would determine the kinds of superstructure or the ideologies, the politics, the culture, the art, the literature that becomes possible. I spoke briefly about it in terms of changing technologies. We look at typewriter to internet to laptops and so on, and how that might change the forms of knowledge production that they enable. While as a part of the base in Marx's model, infrastructure appears deterministic, but it still is quite static. And you will see how when I move further in terms of how infrastructure studies has progressed, emerged as a central analytical focus in the disciplines of anthropology, human geography, urban studies, sociology, and science and technology studies. This was in the classical sociological period, and then as newly independent nation states were emerging, infrastructures were seen as symbols of progress, and they were central to the concerns of policy. They have been central ever since to the concerns of policy. Nehru's famous statement that he made, "Dams are the temples of modern India," right? So there is a huge push on what the infrastructure symbolizes for modernity in our context, for modern India. Then in the 1970s and 80s, with actor network theory, and we've spoken about this in the lectures on Bruno Latour, one starts to see infrastructures not just as things, objects or artifacts, but as networks and social relations. Well, alongside, in urban studies, with the work of David Harvey, when he speaks about the spatial fix, then one of the things he writes about is how every time there is a crisis, there is investments in particular territories on things like infrastructure. So we've seen that with the New Deal in the United States, the production of roads and how that, or railways. We've seen that in India also with the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme and the employment in infrastructure related to that. So the spatial fix comes in to create particular forms of development, particularly also during times of crisis. Urban studies has also pointed to uneven development in terms of uneven development of urbanity, but also of infrastructure, access to infrastructure, how our service networks developed in the informal parts of the city versus the formal parts of the city. You can also look at it at a global scale, the kind of infrastructures that signify world class, for example, is something that is there in the common. Governments advertise producing world class infrastructures for their nation states. Well, then in the early 2000s, you see a plethora of literature focusing on infrastructure, and that one could possibly argue is the moment of the infrastructural turn, where you start to see really deep ethnographies of infrastructures, where you start to see scholars following electricity poles, following water pipelines, looking at what infrastructures promise, what happens when infrastructures break down, how do infrastructures enable or restrict particular forms of social activity, what kinds of state presence do infrastructures allow, and in terms of access, what kinds of citizenship unfolds because of infrastructural presence or absence, right? So these were some of the questions that came up. Anthropology to some extent was at the forefront of this, and so was STS, Science and Technology Studies, especially the work of Susan Leigh-Starr, who started encouraging scholars to do these ethnographies of networks. Now, this was somewhat of a break from the norm. Usually, anthropologists used to go into remote areas, stay in one place for several years, and then write about it as participant observance. But then, how do you study something like a network? How do you study something that is across space and time? So these were the kinds of questions that were coming out and informing the infrastructural turn. Another important aspect in the second phase, one can say, of infrastructural turn was the idea of matter or material to be seen not just as something that is to be used for production of an infrastructure or something that is inert or dead, but as something that has agency and a vitality of its own. Now, all of this come together to form what we know as critical infrastructure studies. I think this would become very clear when I request Sikandar Ali, who is a doctoral student in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences here at IISER Mohali, and is also helping with this course. He is a TA for this course. You might have spoken to him on the discussion chat, and his work lies in the domain of infrastructure studies, mobility studies, and he's making some fundamental contributions to this area. So I will request him to take over and talk about his work.
Hi, my name is Sikandar Ali. I am a PhD scholar at IISER Mohali, and I'm also TAing for this course. In this part of the lecture, we are going to discuss key conceptual frameworks and or themes that emerged over the years in infrastructure studies. These themes are network, assemblage, meshwork, vital matters. At the end of this lecture, I will also discuss my own research, which is on infrastructural development in the Western Himalayan region of Ladakh. Let's begin with the concept of network first. The concept of network is primarily rooted in the actor network theory, developed by the scholars like Bruno Latour, Michael Klon, and John Law in the 1980s. So they argue that the social order and the stability are produced through heterogeneous networks composed of both human and non-human. Here, Bruno Latour also calls these human and both non-humans as actants. He also questions the concept of social in his work. The concept of social, which means he is fundamentally questioning the basics of social theory and social science, When you question social he says connotes only human, but today we face so many crises of climate change, war, exploitation, etc. There he questions the concept of social and calls for instead using actants, or not even using actors, because actors also connote human beings only. He calls them very anthropocentric. So when we bring in this concept of network into the infrastructure studies, the concept views infrastructure as socio-technical networks. Here we have to focus on the concept of social here also. Here you see, in a technical world, an infrastructure is always used to be considered as a technical world. But recently scholars have also started to question that infrastructures are not only made of technologies or made of matters, inert matters, but of also social, economic and material relations. So for example, an electricity grid, let's say an electricity grid is not only made of wires, substations, it is also made of, made by engineers. It also needs regulations, the regulatory institutions. It also needs consumers. Few foundational works are Suzanne Langsderen Ruller's seminal work defines infrastructure as a relational system that typically remains invisible in use, becoming most visible and articulated during the breakdown. Now, our second framework is assemblage. Now, this concept of assemblage draws inspiration from the philosophical work of Deleuze and Guattari, specifically their work A Thousand Plateaux. The assemblage for them is a heterogeneous gathering of elements, including material, objects, human actors, institutions, discourses, and affective relations, which ultimately forms an assemblage or provisional configurations. What distinguishes an assemblage from a network? Assemblages emphasizes emergence, contingency, and transformation, whereas the network focuses on stability and transition. It is less about fixed lines. In the network, we have seen in the network part, the network connotes a stable, fixed points, fixed nodes linked by a fixed lines. But in an assemblage, the assemblage is not about fixed links and more about temporary configurations that can be break apart and become an assemblage again, or take apart, break apart, or reconfigure. Here is our third framework, which is meshwork. This concept is also very important in the field of infrastructure studies. This concept is primarily associated with the anthropological work of Tim Ingold, who develops it as an alternative to the concept of network. As we have shown in this illustration, you can see I have taken this from one of his work. You can see above the concept of meshwork he has illustrated, and the concept of network. The network, here you can see point A to point B to point C. These points are fixed, these nodes are fixed, and those points are linked by these fixed lines also. But if in the case of a meshwork, you see there are lines cutting each other at different points. There is no fixed point, there is no fixed lines. They are emerging and they are interwoven lines of movement, growth, and flow. I have also used meshwork in my own research work. I will discuss it at the end of this lecture. What distinguishes network and assemblage with this framework of meshwork? In a meshwork, entities, let's say, for example, an infrastructure emerges through ongoing process of movement and interaction within the lines, rather than existing and pre-existing nodes that are then connected. There is no fixed point, there are no fixed nodes in a meshwork. These are emerging lines. Next conceptual framework or theme that emerges is think power. This concept, the think power, is very nicely articulated by Jan Bennett in her Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things. She says, things have their own power, things are agential. Bennett introduces think power or vital materialism, the idea that non-human matters such as metal, storms, electricity, or debris possesses its own vitality and degree of some agency. When bring this think power or material agency concept to infrastructure studies, infrastructures are not merely passive matter but are composed of materials with their own capacities and resistance. This includes the natural tendency of roads cracking up during winter, a river overflows, or a wire corrode, or a debris or a stone falls from the slope of a mountain to the road. Small things, small inorganic, we can say, things have their own agential matters. When we talk about agency, we talk about human. Even nowadays we talk about non-human also. Non-human means like more than human things. Animals, we talk about agency. But here Jan Bennett talks about matters, the inert matters. We assume that matters are inert. This computer is inert, this camera is inert, the thing that I'm sitting on, the chair is inert. But she says these things, non-human things have their own agential things. They are vital. So when we bring this concept to infrastructure, we say that infrastructural failure, let's say we bring it to the infrastructural failure, a road breaks down, a wire, an electricity wire breaks down. These failures are understood not as a simple technical breakdowns, but as dynamic interactions between human engineering efforts and the inherent vitality and unpredictable forces of material reality.
Thank you, Sikandar, for so clearly and lucidly laying out for us the various themes that have emerged out of infrastructure studies. I will take a couple of moments here to introduce my own research that draws heavily on this particular framework, and I largely look at circulations. So for more than a decade now, I have been following road construction laborers who move from Jharkhand and seasonally and migrate to the upper reaches of the Himalayas to build the border roads of our country. So I look at circulations that enable the circulations or travel that enables the building of the roads that we travel on. I mean, many of you might have taken trips to Lahaul Spiti, to Ladakh, to Kinnaur, and thought of the areas that you visited as very remote, as something which is quite spectacular also. But then we often forget to give a thought to all those who actually make these infrastructures possible. So that has largely been my work, and I look at the circulations of mostly men in this context, materials, ideas, because the building of a road, one enables the flow of vehicles, but it also enables the flow of ideas. I mean, even if you look at the work of the circular migrants, as they travel, they bring ideas from where they come from, and then they take back ideas to where they belong, right? So it also brings with it the same road that might bring hospitals, might bring diseases. The same road that opens up an economy also transforms fundamentally the economic basis of a particular economy. So roads are in that sense very much a dynamic process. I mean, I don't look at the road as an object, I look at the road as a process. I want to read out a couple of quotations here. One is from the work of Nikhil Anand, whose very important book on hydraulic citizenship traces the water connections in Mumbai. And he writes, "It's promising to enable states to rationally govern subjects from a distance. Infrastructures have since been key sites for the administration of life." So when you look at roads, for example, I mean, he's talking about it in the context of water pipes, but I'm looking at it in the context of a road. What does a road do? A road also claims territory, right? So, which is why one of the major sources of conflict with China is infrastructure. Many times when we look at road building in the upper Himalayas, this aspect comes up a lot, right? China has built roads and railways right up to the border, and therefore we have to rush towards building roads towards the border. There is a presence of the state that comes with the building of infrastructure. There's also the promise of the state that comes with the building of infrastructure, the promise of development that surrounds ideas and the process. Brian Larkin reminds us Infrastructures are not in any positivist sense simply out there. The act of defining an infrastructure is a categorizing movement. Infrastructures are central to how we understand our place in this world, how we are able to access this world, how we are able to lead everyday lives. And some of these things I bring into my work with these road construction laborers and into understanding the history of the Hindustan-Tibet road. Like, what did it enable, what kind of connections it made possible, what kind of ideas spread along with the road, and so on. Alongside, my work also looks at gendered infrastructures. So in the road construction project, for example, I look at notions of masculinity that surround the work of road construction. The idea, for example, that we have conquered nature is a very masculine idea. How the uniformed military official is seen in the context of his masculinity versus the dust-laden, chappal-wearing laborer seen in the context of his masculinity. There are, as Raven Connell has reminded, that there are several masculinities, and within that there is the hegemonic masculinity. Now, in the context of infrastructure, there can be gendered associations in many ways. For example, the connection between the material and the symbolic. Most evident in the naming of public streets, the naming of buildings. Very often the naming of building is in the name of major prominent men, and how often do you see buildings named in in the names of women? Now this might seem like something not as important or critical, but it also presents a certain idea of to whom the public space belongs. I also analyze temporal and rhythmic patterns in terms of who uses infrastructure, who does the work on infrastructure. Here one can look at the example of fetching water, and largely it is the woman's role in the house to fetch water, and if the pipe is not coming right up to the house, then standing in queues to go get that water. Who engages with infrastructure in which way is a gendered narrative. I pay attention to what visible infrastructure conceals, what it enables, and what it denies. Here, this work, one can look at the example of a road. Here there are several layers, both of human sweat, of geological, which a newly tarred road with its shiny, glossy, ribbon-like circulations around a mountain most likely conceals. But I want us to pay attention, and social theory wants us to pay attention to these concealed layers. How does infrastructure appear as a fetish? And what does this fetish conceal? In trying to look at gender infrastructures, and this is collaborative work with Yafa Truelove. We have an edited collection that I had in the first slide of this presentation. We look at different scales. So the scale of the body be connected to the global scale, and here the most recent example I can think of is ongoing war in Iran and the limits to LPG cylinders that this has caused. So what is happening far away is having an impact on our kitchens, right? So it's important to see these interscalar linkages. It is important to see how the most intimate might actually connect with the global. This is what infrastructure studies enables us to do. I want to once again hand over to Sikandar and requesting him to speak about his own work in Kargil on roads. Thank you.
In my own research, my research is on roads and road infrastructure in Western Himalayas, Ladakh. I call it alternative concept of infrastructure. My work contrasts the modern planning ideologies, Aristotelian helomorphic imagination, the belief in imposing a fixed form on inert passive matter. Here, what I mean Aristotelian helomorphic imagination, Aristotle conceptualized everything around us is made up of two things, form and matter, body and soul. Like that, when modern engineering, modern planning only assumes that there is a landscape, there is a land, inert land or a dead line that needs to be fixed, with a planning idea, with an engineering idea, the assumption that the land or the landscape is lying down there as a dead matter. This is what I mean in Aristotelian helomorphic imagination in my research. Now, I contrasted this with the traditional pathways in the region, operated as flexible pathways. In my research, I compare this modern planned fixed engineering roads and tunnels with traditional pathways or indigenously conceptualized pathways in the region of Western Himalayan region of Ladakh. Now, these traditional pathways operated as flexible paths, a meshwork system constantly adapted to challenges of terrain, extreme weather, and the local ecology. Here I introduce a local concept which is known as LUM, an indigenous concept literally translates into pathways. However, these pathways are flexible and acknowledge the existence of more than human and their importance. There are human pathways, there are human LUMs, there are pastoral LUMs, there are even designated pathways for floods and waterways. My work studies these multi-species and more than human infrastructures and bring to the forefront alternate infrastructures in comparison to modern linear, fixed, and only technological infrastructures. And we hear every year that we hear and see that roads are broken down in the Himalayas due to extreme climatic conditions. Tunnels are breaking down. In these infrastructures in environmentally sensitive regions like the Himalayas are consistently breaking down. These consistent breakdowns are not solely due to engineering and planning failure. I argue in my research that there is a fundamental ontological friction or conflict, which I call ontological incommensurability in my research, between two worlds and their ontological assumption. Here what I mean two worlds: ontological assumption of modern engineering and the ontological assumption of the traditional pathways. The modern engineering pathways are only for humans and our human cars. In that world, there is no space for more than humans. There is no space for other things. There is no acceptance of local ecologies in the construction of those pathways. But in the traditional pathways that I used here, LUM is very accommodative and it acknowledges the existence of other than humans. Now, the ontological assumptions of modern roads and tunnels are, I also call it helomorphic and anthropocentric. On the other hand, the LUM, the local indigenous concept, acknowledges and accommodates other than human in its world. The cosmology of LUM is these pathways or LUMs are for humans and pastoral animals, and there are even specifically designated pathways for what we say inorganic entities and processes such as floods, such as avalanches, such as water. There is a proverb which is Chulamachu Rudlama Rut. It means that there is a route for flood, there is a route for water. Water will follow that route, the flood will follow that route whenever they want. There is no restriction on them. You have to leave them their own space, their own path to flow. Thank you.